Today we're going to read the second part of the trickster tale that we began in the last lesson. Remember from the story The Frog Race. That's the story we read before. The characters are two men, Big Jim and Pete. The story takes place a long time ago in the West, and the events are that Big Jim brags that his frog is the fastest in the land. A stranger, Pete, challenges Big Jim and his frog to a race, but he doesn't have a frog of his own. While Big Jim heads to the stream to get a frog for Pete, he leaves his frog with Pete. Remember when we looked at this picture in the last lesson and we said that when somebody is talking, that is called dialogue. And we use quotation marks in reading and writing to show that dialogue is happening. We're going to see more dialogue in our story today. In our story today, we're going to see some words that have the double O spelling. They have the oo sound and the sound. The words that have the oo sound are drooled and whoop. The sounds are looked, took, and goodness. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the vocabulary words we're going to be seeing in our story. Stunned. That's when you're shocked or surprised. For example, we were stunned when our team lost the tournament. Some sayings that are going to be in our story today are hitched up or pulled up with a sudden movement. For example, the farmer hitched up his pants as he waded through the mud. Or solid as a rock, which means very hard. For example, we left the modeling clay out overnight and it was solid as a rock in the morning. So here we go. The frog race. Dad, Mike said when he woke up, "What happened with the jumping frog? I missed the end of the tale. I was sleeping." "I did not tell it to the end," said his dad. "When you drifted off to sleep, I stopped." "Oh, tell the ending," said Mike. Mike's dad picked up the tale where he had left off. Big Jim handed his frog to Pete and ran off to the stream. Pete held Big Jim's frog in his hand. Pete looked at the frog. Then Pete reached into his pocket and got a pile of limes. Yum! Big Jim's frog drooled. The frog ate the whole pile of limes from Pete's hand. Then Pete set the frog down. While Pete was feeding the frog limes, Big Jim was down at the stream. He tossed off his boots and went frog hunting. At last he nabbed a nice green frog. He ran back and handed the frog to Pete. "There's your frog," said Jim. "Just set him down there next to my frog. Then we will let them compete to see which one of them is the fastest." Pete set his frog down. "All set?" said Jim. "All set," said the man. Then Jim yelled, "Jump, frogs, jump!" Pete gave the two frogs a tap to get them jumping. His frog hopped off nice and quick, but Jim's frog just sat there. Once he hitched up his legs like he was fixin' to jump, but it was no use. With all those limes in him, he was planted there just as solid as a rock. His tummy was full. Pete's frog hopped and hopped till it got to the finish line. "Fine race," said Pete. He took Jim's $10 and slipped the cash in his pocket. Then Pete tipped his hat and set off. Well, Big Jim was stunned. "What happened to my frog?" he said. "I hope he's not sick." He bent down and picked up the frog and rubbed his tummy. "Goodness," said Jim. "He must have had a big lunch." "I think Pete tricked me. He fed my frog too much to eat," Jim said. Big Jim let out a whoop. His face got red. Jim ran to catch Pete, but it was no use. Pete had run off. Pete had tricked Big Jim. What is the setting of the frog race and the jumping frog? The West, or the Wild West, the frontier. It was a long time ago. It was outside. Who are the characters in the story? Big Jim, who was a bragger, and Pete, a stranger, the trickster. What is the plot of the story? What is the setting of the frog race and the jumping frog? Well, remember we said it was in the West, the Wild West or the Old West, and it was in the frontier. It was a long time ago. It was outside. Who are the characters in the story? Big Jim, who was the bragger, and Pete, who was a stranger and the trickster. What is the plot of the story? Big Jim brags about his frog and says that no frog is faster. Pete accepts the challenge and tricks Big Jim by feeding limes to Big Jim's frog so he can't move. What type of fiction genre is the frog race? It's a trickster tale. Who is the trickster? What event made this story a trickster tale? Well, Pete is the trickster because he tricked Big Jim by feeding his frog lime so the frog couldn't jump. So here we can see all of that information in our chart. So the story was the jumping frog. The genre or the kind of story was a trickster tale. It was set in the West long ago. The characters are Big Jim and Pete. And the plot is that Big Jim challenges Pete to race his frog.